candidate for the MAS party, Luis Arce, receives a hero's welcome in Bolivia. Confirmed cases of the novel coronavirus in China climb past 4,000. And we take a look at Juan Guaido's recent tour of Europe. Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. Thousands of people rallied outside the El Alto airport in Bolivia to greet presidential candidate Luis Arce on his arrival from Argentina. Social movements gathered since early in the day, giving a hero's welcome to the candidate for the Movement Towards Socialism party and his running mate, David Choquehuanca. This is Arce's first time back in Bolivia since he was officially nominated to represent the MAS IPSP in the upcoming general elections. But shortly after his arrival, the de facto government served Arce with a legal notice in relation to an investigation into the alleged breach of his duties. According to the notice, Arce is expected in court on Wednesday to be questioned by prosecutors. This investigation was announced a day after his nomination as candidate by the MAS IPSP party and comes as part of the ongoing persecution of party members and supporters. Barely a month into the 2020 systematic killing of social leaders and former FARC combatants in Colombia, it continues with no end in sight. And as has become the norm, the government of President Ivan Duque does next to nothing to put an end to this alarming situation.
The latest victim of the systematic persecution of social leaders and former FARC combatants is John Freddy Vargas Rojas, who was killed in Pitalito in the department of Huila. He was the fourth former FARC combatant murdered this year, bringing the total number of guerrillas slain since the 2016 peace deal to 184.
There have been ongoing violations by the government on the guarantees that were agreed upon in 2016. Armed groups continue working with impunity, and the state never created a commission to find and prosecute paramilitary groups for their crimes. This has only aggravated the current crisis.
There is also an alarming number of political prisoners who were members of the FARC, whose legal situation remains uncertain 3 years after the peace deal was signed. Their limbo also violates both the peace deal and an amnesty law.
There have been clear delays by the state and the special jurisdiction for peace to resolve the situation of 200 political prisoners. They have been waiting for years to have their alleged crimes investigated by the GEP and hopefully be freed.
Colombia's current right-wing ruling party always opposed the dialogue process and the resulting peace deal. Party members have strongly advocated for the withdrawal of the peace agreement, and now they are trying to halt the implementation of the accords and whole peace-building process in Colombia.
We must not forget that we are in the presence of a political entity that has no interest in the implementation of the agreements under the original terms, because doing so would weaken their political agenda, which represents the most extreme sectors of the Colombian right. These sectors have used conflict and war as ways to grab power, to enrich themselves, and to preserve a system of domination.
21 social leaders and 4 former FARC combatants have been killed during the first month of 2020, but the government of Ivan Duque continues to turn a blind eye to the situation.
On Monday night, people in Cuba paid tribute to the national hero Jose Marti on the eve of the 167th anniversary of his birth. Led by the first secretary of the Communist Party, Raúl Castro, and President Miguel Díaz-Canel, close to 30,000 marched across Havana, holding torches, paying tribute to a similar march held in 1953 by university students against the fascist regime of dictator Fulgencio Batista.
At the historic stairs of the University of Havana, everything was ready for the march. Havana once again became witness to an event that pays tribute to one of the island's most important heroes. Close to 30,000 people marched to the old San Lázaro quarry, as they also paid tribute to a similar march in 1953, held in defiance of the then dictator Fulgencio Batista.
Marti is one of the pillars of the revolution. Fidel used many of his ideas to walk the path that he did, to have a successful revolution and to make Cuba what it is today. Marti's most beautiful gift is his love for all people.
This year's march also took time to condemn recent acts of vandalism on statues of the national hero that were financed by counter-revolutionary groups based in Miami.
This march has a historic vision, and we stand in solidarity with Cuba. Marching today is very important to show that Cuba is not alone.
But it wasn't just Cubans who paid tribute to José Martí. Among the masses, there were also people from a number of international social and student movements.
This march has a historic vision, and we stand in solidarity with Cuba. Marching today is very important to show that Cuba is not alone.
This is how Cubans and people from abroad paid tribute to José Martí, by carrying the torch of dignity and defending just causes around the world.
The death toll for China's novel coronavirus has risen to 106. The revised figures were released by the National Health Commission this Tuesday. The NHC said it has also confirmed 4,535 cases of the pneumonia-like illness, of which more than 900 are severe. Meanwhile, a total of 60 patients have been reportedly cured and discharged.
Wuhan has started to urgently build two hospitals, namely Huo Shenshan Hospital and Leishan Hospital, which are scheduled to provide 2,300 beds. The construction of Huo Shenshan Hospital is to be completed by February the 2nd, and then will be transferred to military management as we have military medical teams. The construction of the Leishan Hospital will be finished on February 5th. In addition, as the fourth batch of hospital deployment, Wuhan City will take over 14 hospitals for urgent use, including the new hospital of the Dongji Medical College under the Huasong University of Science and Technology and the Remning Hospital of Wuhan University. A total of over 10,000 beds will be enough for the current suspected and confirmed cases, including those who are running fever and still under medical observations.
The city of Wuhan remains deserted after the government placed a lockdown on the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in an effort to contain its spread. 15 cities have been placed under lockdown. 30 provinces have launched a level 1 emergency response, while Hong Kong declared its highest emergency response. Meanwhile, there are 52 confirmed cases of the virus outside of China. Germany, Canada, and Sri Lanka announced their first infections on Monday, bringing the total number of countries with confirmed cases to 15. And the head of the World Health Organization has expressed confidence in China's epidemic prevention and control measures. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus made the comment during his spontaneous visit to the country, where he met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi this Tuesday. He said the WHO does not recommend the evacuation of foreign nationals and urged the international community to remain calm. Coming up, 5 people escaped with their lives after a blast at a school in Jamaica. Stay with us for more. Unilateral sanctions imposed on Venezuela continue to harm everyday people. Despite this fact, members of the opposition continue to demand more sanctions, this time from the European Union. We have more in this report.
The maritime trade and access to medicine could be greatly affected by a possible increase in sanctions coming from the European Union against Venezuela. This will come to pass if opposition figure Juan Guaidó gets his wish, as he asked international governments for their help during a speech at the Davos Economic Forum.
We must give further use to the tools that the free world has. Sanctions have been controversial, but they are the only tools we have to face off against these regimes, and they must be used with a steady hand.
Guaidó's European trip put on full display the diplomatic and political contradictions that his backers use to justify their support, as the lawmaker continues to dispute his self-proclaimed role as president of the National Assembly of Venezuela.
In the global stage, Europe does not hold the same weight as in the last century. Now the real economic power is in emerging countries, and there is a rupture in the guidelines given by Washington. Some European officials recognize Guaidó as the president of the National Assembly and others as interim president. His visit was unsuccessful. There were no diplomatic results.
The decision by Spain's government to not recognize him in his self-proclaimed role and of President Sanchez to not meet with him further hurt his tour.
Promoting economic sanctions so that people suffer, to try and overthrow a democratic government, and to avoid dialogue and peace is a mistake. In my opinion, the principles of peaceful coexistence and of resolving issues by talking need to have a stronger role, especially after what we have seen happen in the Middle East.
Since 2018, the European Union has imposed sanctions on Venezuelan officials, but various investigations confirm that the measures always end up affecting the people of Venezuela, contrary to what the United States and the opposition claim.
The right wing lies through its teeth to their supporters, telling them sanctions only hurt the government. The truth is sanctions directly hurt oil production, food and medicine imports, and other industries. They are a direct attack on our people.
Guaidó embodies the submission of someone who says he stands for the Venezuelan state. This leaves a bad taste in the mouth of those governments that chose to welcome him, because he has no concept of sovereignty and legitimacy. He wants us to be a colony.
In the meantime, Venezuela continues to build up its relationship with allied countries like China and Russia in order to import medicine and food. The government is also expanding its work with the United Nations to fight the outcome of sanctions.
So to discuss more on Juan Guaidó's attempt at securing international support, we are joined by Louie Lange from the ALBA movement in Canada. Hi, Louie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My first question to you, can you tell us how social movements reacted to Juan Guaidó's visit to Canada and the reception he would have gotten from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau?
Well, our reaction to his visit is the same as when his so-called ambassador was holding meetings here, which is that our reaction is based on the fact that he's not the democratically elected president of Venezuela. And we believe that it's the Venezuelan people that should decide who is their leader, and the Canadian government and the U.S. government have no business telling the Venezuelan people what democracy is. It's the Venezuelan people to decide their affairs, and our movement, our organization, is in solidarity with the rights of the Venezuelans to determine their own future. So this was our reaction, and that's why we held a demonstration on Parliament Hill when Mr. Trudeau decided to meet this false imposter who was pretending to be president of Venezuela.
And what would you say are some of the policies of Trudeau's government that are also being rejected by social movements?
Well, we think that the fact that the Canadian government is supporting the sanctions and the blockade against Venezuela is a hypocritical move. Mr. Trudeau keeps saying that Canada is a country based on laws. But the fact of the matter is that these sanctions and the blockade are a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. They're a violation of the OAS Charter and the Vienna Conventions. And it's basically an act of war to make the people suffer. The collective punishment of populations, which is the end result of these sanctions, and in this case, the Venezuelan people, we consider this to be a crime against humanity, and the Canadian people oppose this, and this is why, in our solidarity with the Venezuelan people, is to demand that the Canadian government not support the U.S. sanctions and withdraw from them, and allow the Venezuelan people to exercise their right to live in the way that they want.
That actually brings me to this question. How would you describe the relationship between Canada and the U.S. as it relates to their interests in Latin America?
Well, the relationship between Canada and the U.S. Is one of subordination. It's the U.S. policy that the Canadian government is continuously trying to implement, and they do it blindly. Like Mr. Trudeau claims that Juan Guaido is the president of Venezuela simply because the U.S. says so, and he ignores the fact that he was not elected by any official in the National Assembly. He was not. He has no. There was no democratic election by the Venezuelan people regarding the presidency. So Mr. Trudeau is simply following the foreign policy of the U.S. government, which continuously tries to use its power in order to attack democratic, constitutional governments in Latin America, such as Cuba, Nicaragua, and of course Venezuela. These attacks are coming on a regular basis, and the imperialist policy which is being followed is simply being implemented by the Trudeau government blindly. So we're asking the Trudeau government to have a foreign policy based on rule of law and not based on what U.S. interests are trying to achieve in the Caribbean, which is to try to undermine the governments that are using their powers in order for the benefit of the people.
Louis, it actually raises a good point and a good question. Why do you think Justin Trudeau is blindly following the lead of the U.S.? Because we have seen the United States actually, take certain measures against countries who would support the legitimate government of Venezuela.
Yes, well, the foreign policy issue is one aspect, but of course, Canada is also under the control of the U.S. in terms of trade policy. So now Canada has to ratify the new NAFTA agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So there's a great deal of pressure that is put on Canada to be to subordinate itself to the interests of the U.S. And so Mr. Trudeau, instead of speaking on behalf of the Canadian people, is simply enunciating what the foreign policy of the U.S. is, and he's also saying that it's almost it's necessary for Canada to be in this subordinate position with the U.S. in order for it to survive economically. So all kinds of pressure is put on Canada, and this government has doesn't seem to have any interest in following its own independent policy and trying to eliminate some of the bad effects that this policy is having on our economy and our own foreign policies and our own positions that we take internationally.
And most recently, Juan Guaido has called on the European Union to broaden sanctions against Venezuela, which negatively impact his own people. What are your thoughts on that? And in particular, why should governments reject such requests?
Well, as I said earlier, the issue of the U.S. sanctions is a very, very important issue. And when sanctions and a blockade are imposed, like the ones that are imposed against Venezuela, and as well the stepping up of sanctions and the blockade of Cuba, these are what they constitute is a collective punishment of the populations. So the U.S. is using its methods in order to tell the people that we don't like the governments that are in power, and we want regime change, and we're going to punish you as long as you keep supporting these governments. So this kind of collective punishment of people is a violation of the United Nations Charter. It's a violation of all humanitarian principles, and it actually constitutes, I think, an act of war. And that's why our organization, which is an anti-imperialist organization in solidarity with the people, to have their who are fighting for peace and freedom and democracy and their rights, they have to stand up against these countries. Against the U.S., who is trying to impose their own form of governments. And so this is a very important issue that is taking place. And I think that in the coming year, this is going to become even more important, because from the way Mr. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was acting in his last visit in Latin America, it was clear that they intend to step up the attacks against Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and now they're putting in place their own government in Bolivia, and the people are being persecuted on the basis that the U.S. wants to achieve regime change in these countries.
Now, you mentioned U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who recently made a trip to Latin America and some Caribbean, well, actually Jamaica. Only a few Caribbean leaders were invited, and in fact, the head of CARICOM refused to send a representative because she said it was an attempt to divide the region. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, I think that it's very important that CARICOM took that position, because what the U.S. is trying to do is they're trying to divide the countries in order to be able to push for their own policies. So the actual offensive against the Latin American countries, like for instance, this is what they did in the OAS as well, when they could not win a resolution against Venezuela in the OAS. The U.S. got Canada to form the Lima Group, and they're trying to do the same thing in CARICOM, where they don't. CARICOM has so far stood against the actions of the U.S., and they've stood in solidarity with Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. And this is one of the reasons why Pompeo went to Latin America, in order to try to divide these countries and try to impose, give the impression that he has support. And of course, it's not true. He doesn't have the majority of support. And as you point out, only a small number of leaders of the CARICOM countries actually went to meet him. So this is, I think, CARICOM is playing a very positive role. And we hope that they continue to stand up for, take a principled position.
Thank you so much for joining us and providing your thoughts on that recent visit by Juan Guaido to Canada. That was Louie Lange of the ALBA movement in Canada joining us.
Thank you very much.
Shifting gears now, a full ceremonial military display has taken place at the opening of the historic Red House in Trinidad and Tobago on Friday. The regiment, Coast Guard, Police and Air Force Reserves participated. All 42 members of Parliament and 31 senators were present for the event. The original building was ironically destroyed by fire in the 1903 water riots and rebuilt in 1907. It was also the scene of a showdown between law enforcement and members of the Jamaat al-Muslimin, who staged a coup to overthrow the government on July 27, 1990. The Red House is one of 5 historic buildings in Port of Spain and was restored after more than a decade to the tune of $65 million, a figure the government has defended.
We in Trinidad and Tobago, we are traveling people, and we go to other people's countries and we marvel at their symbolism and their symbols. In Australia, we marvel at the Sydney Opera House. In Washington, we spend vacations staring at the Capitol and the obelisk. And in London, we look at the Palace of Westminster and we don't ask how much it costs to maintain. Ladies and gentlemen, it said that we should have spent the money that we did on renovation here on social services and feeding the poor. We did both. We spent the $5 billion a year on social support services, and we spent the money in renovating and restoring our parliament.
Classes have been suspended at the Villa Road Primary School in Jamaica after an explosion injured 5 people on Monday. Reports say the blast occurred due to a leak during the delivery of LPG gas, which led to a fire. The victims are said to be 3 cafeteria workers and 2 employees from the gas company Petcom. They suffered 1st and 3rd degree burns. Students were taken to a nearby residential property for safety. Classes are expected to resume this week. Demonstrators have gathered in Barcelona in solidarity with the 9 Catalan politicians who were slapped with harsh sentences last year. The group also rejects the central government's move on Monday to strip separatist leader Quim Torra of his role as a lawmaker. Armed with pro-independence flags, protesters mobilized outside Catalonia's parliament, chanting in support of the men, condemning their political persecution. French firefighters have protested in the capital Paris to demand a pay increase and improvements to their working conditions. However, police used tear gas and batons to disperse thousands of their fellow servicemen. The resilient firefighters continue to march as they demanded an increase in their hazard bonus, which they say has not been reviewed since 1990. France has been experiencing widespread labor unrest for over a year, with various sectors protesting for better living conditions and in rejection to President Emmanuel Macron's economic policies. And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. For our viewers in Africa, remember you can find us on Starsat Channel 461 in South Africa and Channel 539 in Nigeria. And join us on social media. For Telesur English, I'm Doris Polo. Thanks for watching.